Does Dan McClellan know the difference between an empirical fact on the one hand and a contention or inference from an empirical fact on the other hand? I don't think he does, at least when it comes to handling the Levitical prohibitions of male same-sex intercourse and their relation to female same-sex intercourse. Hi, my name is Robert Gagnon. I'm a visiting scholar of the Bible at Wesley Biblical Seminary in Ridgeland, Mississippi. I have published extensively on the Bible and homosexuality in scholarly works, including a 500-page book on the subject. This is part 2 of my response to McClellan's 22-minute video, melodramatically entitled, My Final Response to Robert Gagnon, Once More Into the Breach, which is a response to one of my videos, Is Dan McClellan Right That Ancient Israel Accepted Lesbianism? There I had shown why his apparent view that the authors of Leviticus 18 and 20 had no problem with lesbian intercourse had to be wrong. McClellan has finally admitted to me that the authors of the Levitical Holiness Code
probably would have rejected
female same-sex intercourse, but he continues to maintain the contradictory view.
You cannot interpret Leviticus 18 and 20 to be universally condemning any and all homosexual practice,
because he insists that lesbian intercourse is not being condemned. In a sleight of hand move, McClellan plays on his audience's confusion regarding two senses of the word condemn in the statement,
be universally condemning any and all homosexual practice.
Condemning doesn't just mean imposing a capital sentence. It means, according to Merriam-Webster at least, to declare to be reprehensible, wrong, or evil. Here are the two options. One option is that McClellan is contending only that Leviticus literally doesn't contain an explicit prohibition of female same-sex intercourse. But this is a nonsense contention because no one contests it. McClellan could not have used it to refute my argument that the prohibition of male same-sex intercourse was effectively a prohibition of homosexual practice. The second option is that McClellan is contending that the authors of Leviticus 18 and 20 did not take a negative view of lesbian intercourse. They didn't have a problem with it. They permitted or accepted it. This is the sense that Leviticus scholar Jacob Milgrom gives it, and McClellan made a point of saying that he was in agreement with Milgrom. It is the only way that McClellan could differentiate his view from mine, though he would be wrong in making that claim. McClellan claims in his latest response to me that he all along meant do not universally condemn homosexual practice only in this first, literal, wooden sense. This is most evident later in his video, when McClellan responds to the following statement that I make about the Apostle Paul. It's a good thing that we have Romans 1:26. Otherwise, McClellan would be saying, look, Paul used only the term arsenokoitai, men lying with a male, in 1 Corinthians 6:9 and 1 Timothy 1:10. So he must have no problem with lesbianism. McClellan responded,
but if we did not have Romans 1, I would say Paul doesn't condemn female same-sex intercourse. Gagnon knows the difference between saying Paul doesn't condemn, which is an observation of an empirical fact in the absence of Romans 1, versus Paul had no problem with.
This is classic gaslighting. McClellan is applying my hypothetical analogy regarding Paul to the Levitical prohibitions, saying that the phrase doesn't condemn is just, quote, an empirical fact, that an explicit prohibition is lacking. McClellan is trying to act like all he ever meant by denying
Leviticus 18 and 20 to be universally condemning any and all homosexual practice
is that it
conspicuously omits female same-sex intercourse.
That's an impossible interpretation of his own conclusion under the normal usage of language. There are at least 5 reasons why it is obvious that McClellan was not simply stating an empirical fact, but rather was asserting an inference from that empirical fact, namely that the authors of Leviticus 18 and 20 did not reject female same-sex intercourse. First, it would be a tautology, that is, a meaningless redundancy, if he were only stating an empirical fact. Effectively, he would be saying the following gibberish, quote, Leviticus 18 and 20 can't be giving an explicit prohibition of female same-sex intercourse because they rather conspicuously do not give an explicit prohibition of female same-sex intercourse. Sorry, it's a little humorous. In his prior videos, McClellan was not uttering a meaningless redundancy. At least let's hope not. He was making an inference from an empirical fact, the absence of an explicit prohibition of female same-sex intercourse, to conclude that the prohibitions of male same-sex intercourse do not apply to, cannot be extended in scope to, or do not imply in any way a rejection of female same-sex intercourse. That conclusion is not an empirical fact. It's a false inference from an empirical fact. Second, McClellan appeals to scholarly authority for a contention that he makes, not for an empirical fact. When McClellan has to appeal to scholarly authority for his conclusion, it's self-evident that he is not appealing to an authority for confirmation about an empirical fact that everybody can see with their own eyes. McClellan contended, in contrast to my description of Leviticus 18:22 and 20:13 as prohibitions of homosexual practice,
that Jacob Milgrom agrees with me that these passages in Leviticus 18 and 20 are limited only to male same-sex intercourse.
In so doing, McClellan is not merely saying that Milgrom agrees with him that Leviticus 18 and 20 contain no explicit prohibition of lesbian intercourse. I can see that there's no explicit prohibition of lesbian intercourse, as can anyone else. There's no need to appeal to an authority for that contention. No one contests it, least of all me. Unless McClellan has entered the realm of the absurd, he must be appealing to Milgrom as an authority for a statement that is contested, a contention or an inference drawn from an empirical fact, namely that the authors of Leviticus 18 and 20 would not have had a problem with lesbian intercourse. And indeed, that's what Milgrom does. Milgrom thinks that by the standards of the authors of the Levitical Holiness Code, that it is okay for Jewish women to engage in lesbian intercourse. That's what he means when he says, quote, "It is incorrect to apply this prohibition of male same-sex intercourse on a universal scale." McClellan not only says that Milgrom agrees with him about that,
Leviticus 18 and 20 only apply to male same-sex intercourse,
but also declares,
this raises one of my big concerns with Gagnon's attempt to assert the universality of this morality.
Indeed, McClellan says,
my contention is that these prohibitions are only relevant to male Jewish people and anyone residing within the land of Israel, as I have always said. This prohibition in Leviticus 18 and 20 has absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with female same-sex intercourse, so it is very clearly not a universal prohibition on any and all homosexual practice, even if we understand it to apply beyond the land of Israel to people beyond the house of Israel. It still is quite explicitly limited to male same-sex intercourse. Irrespective of how widely we extend the scope of that prohibition in regards to the identification of Israel, it still does not apply to female same-sex intercourse.
A contention is something that needs to be proved.
My contention is that these prohibitions are only relevant to male Jewish people.
It's not an empirical fact that's obvious to all. Nobody would say, for example, quote, "It is my contention that the Levitical prohibitions don't explicitly prohibit marrying someone of the opposite sex." Contention? Who's arguing otherwise? Third, McClellan insists that Leviticus 18:22 and 20:13 do not even imply a rejection of female same-sex intercourse. McClellan asserts, wrongly to be sure, that
the notion that female same-sex intercourse is implicit in Leviticus 18 and 20 is not true.
And that, unlike Paul's rejection of lesbian intercourse in Romans 1:26, we cannot
extend the scope of that prohibition and apply to female same-sex intercourse.
When he makes these claims, McClellan is clearly contending for something beyond the non-contestable, factual assertion that Leviticus 18 and 20 lack an explicit prohibition of female same-sex intercourse. This is a contestable statement, not an empirical fact. Indeed, it's flatly wrong. Fourth, we can make an analogy to McClellan's claims about lesbian intercourse that proves that McClellan is drawing an inference from an empirical fact. Take the empirical fact that Leviticus 18 and 20 do not contain an explicit prohibition of incest with one's daughter or full sister. Leviticus 18 and 20 do prohibit explicitly sex with a daughter-in-law or granddaughter and sex with a half-sister, stepsister, or sister-in-law. Milgrom himself admits that sex with one's daughter or full sister is subsumed as obvious under these other prohibitions and under the general incest prohibition in 18:6 that forbids sexual intercourse with, quote, the flesh of your own flesh. But Milgrom does not make the same obvious connection for lesbian intercourse when treating the prohibition of male same-sex intercourse, and that's because Milgrom is an apologist for LGBTQ stuff. Apply McClellan's stated conclusions about lesbian intercourse to the parallel of incest with one's daughter or full sister. Suppose McClellan said, quote, Jacob Milgrom agrees with me that these passages in Leviticus 18 and 20, so far as incest with a child or sibling are concerned, are limited only to incest with one's daughter-in-law, granddaughter, half-sister, stepsister, and sister-in-law. I'm concerned with Gagnon's attempt to assert the universality of this morality. The notion that incest with one's daughter or full sister is implicit in the prohibitions of incest with a daughter-in-law, granddaughter, half-sister, stepsister, and sister-in-law in Leviticus 18 and 20 is not true. We cannot extend the scope of these Levitical prohibitions to apply to incest with one's daughter or full sister. Any reasonable person would conclude that McClellan was going beyond the fact that there is no explicit prohibition of incest with a full sister or with a daughter to draw an inference or to make a contention that the authors of Leviticus 18 and 20 had no problem with incest with one's full sister or daughter. There is no other reasonable interpretation if one takes the communication symbols of language seriously. Fifth, McClellan clearly conjoins this contention with a parallel second contention, namely that the fact that the prohibitions are addressing Israelites shows that they have no moral relevance for Gentiles outside the Holy Land. This is taken by McClellan as a second proof, alongside the reference only to males, that the prohibitions are not
universally condemning any and all homosexual practice.
Thus, he says, in his responding to Robert Gagnon video, his first response to me,
that Jacob Milgrom agrees with me that these passages in Leviticus 18 and 20 are limited only to male same-sex intercourse, are limited only to same-sex intercourse taking place within the land of Israel, and are limited only to members of the house of Israel. As he has emphatically made clear, there's nothing about these prohibitions that apply to anyone outside the land of Israel who is not a member of the house of Israel. And this raises one of my big concerns with Gagnon's attempt to assert the universality of this morality, because God doesn't seem to care about any of these same-sex acts taking place in other nations.
In his second response to me, McClellan reiterated the pairing.
My contention is that these prohibitions are only relevant to male Jewish people and anyone residing within the land of Israel, as I have always said. This prohibition in Leviticus 18 and 20 has absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with female same-sex intercourse, so it is very clearly not a universal prohibition on any and all homosexual practice, even if we understand it to apply beyond the land of Israel to people beyond the house of Israel. It still is quite explicitly limited to male same-sex intercourse.
McClellan's response is all about defending the view that Leviticus 18:22 and 20:13 do not apply to the nations in any way, even that God does not think that it is morally wrong when Gentiles outside of Israel engage in any of the sexual abominations of Leviticus 18. That demonstrates that he was making the same claim about females engaging in same-sex intercourse. For McClellan, as with Gentiles outside the Holy Land, engaging in male same-sex intercourse, so too females, Jew or Gentile, in the Holy Land or outside the Holy Land, who engaged in female same-sex intercourse. It simply wasn't a moral problem for the authors of Leviticus 18 and 20. That's McClellan's contention. It was permitted and acceptable. To sum up, when McClellan asserts that the Levitical prohibition of male same-sex intercourse
is very clearly not a universal prohibition on any and all homosexual practice,
he has obviously gone beyond a restatement of empirical fact into interpretation of the data that is highly contested and, indeed, as I have shown, surely wrong. Don't fall for the gaslighting when McClellan argues that all he was doing when he said Leviticus 18 and 20
does not condemn female same-sex intercourse,
was making
which is an observation of an empirical fact in the absence of
an explicit prohibition of female same-sex intercourse. If all McClellan were saying is that Leviticus 18 and 20 don't contain an explicit prohibition of female same-sex intercourse, a point of fact that no one contests, he would have been contributing absolutely nothing to the discussion. McClellan says,
So there's a big difference between saying Leviticus 18 and 20 omit any condemnation of female same-sex intercourse and saying that the omission of female same-sex intercourse from Leviticus 18 and 20 means that they would have approved of female same-sex intercourse. I said the former.
No, as I just pointed out, McClellan didn't just say that Leviticus 18 and 20 omit any explicit condemnation of female same-sex intercourse. The whole point of McClellan's corollary argument about an explicit prohibition of woman-animal sex was that if the authors of Leviticus had meant their prohibition of male same-sex intercourse to imply a prohibition of female same-sex intercourse, they would have stated so explicitly. If a prohibition of female same-sex intercourse is not implicit in an explicit prohibition of male same-sex intercourse, where exactly would their probable rejection of lesbian intercourse come from? From what moral logic? McClellan conveniently never offers an explanation for why he concedes that the authors of Leviticus 18 and 20
Probably would have rejected
lesbian intercourse. He rejects all my explanations, including the moral logic of the prohibitions of male same-sex intercourse, but he offers absolutely no explanation of his own. The reason that he offers none is that he does not want to be seen as arguing directly against himself. McClellan states,
Gagnon is acting as if I said the latter because it's a lot easier to demonstrate that that's not the case than it is to demonstrate that Leviticus 18 and 20 are condemning female same-sex intercourse.
This very allegation on McClellan's part is nonsensical. Again, by analogy, this is like McClellan saying that, quote, it's a lot easier to demonstrate that the authors of Leviticus 18 and 20 did not approve of incest with one's full sister than it is to demonstrate that Leviticus 18 and 20 are implicitly condemning incest with one's full sister when they explicitly condemn incest with one's half-sister, stepsister, and sister-in-law. No, it's not a lot easier. It's the same thing said twice. And no, I am not acting as if McClellan said that the authors of Leviticus 18 and 20 would have approved of female same-sex intercourse. That is the intermediate premise that his conclusion demands, namely, his conclusion that no prohibition of female same-sex intercourse can be extended from or is implied by the explicit prohibition of male same-sex intercourse. McClellan can't have it both ways.
So this is a straw man.
No, I'm good. McClellan creates his own straw man in his latest video, speaking out of two sides of his mouth, claiming that he is not saying something that he clearly has been saying all along. Again, either McClellan is intentionally deceiving, in other words, gaslighting his audience, or he is cognitively challenged when it comes to the Bible and homosexuality, owing to his enslavement to LGBTQ dogma. Pick whichever option you feel is more complementary to McClellan. There are only two options available. The accusation of a straw man argument is a classic example of projection on McClellan's part, a gaslighting strategy. McClellan says
he has to attack a claim that I have not made so he can make it seem like he's actually got a plausible case against me.
I not only have a plausible case against McClellan, I have a conclusive one. McClellan has no case at all. And no, I have not attacked a claim that McClellan has not made. I have critiqued an intermediate premise that is required for McClellan's conclusion to follow logically. And I have also attacked his conclusion that the authors of Leviticus 18 and 20 did not, implicitly or by extension from an explicit prohibition of male same-sex intercourse, reject female same-sex intercourse. McClellan has created an impossible contradiction in terms. He's contending that the authors of Leviticus 18 and 20 both
Probably would have rejected
female same-sex intercourse on the one hand, and were not implicitly or by extension condemning it on the other hand. Yet to reject it is to condemn it. McClellan is twisting himself and his fan base into pretzels. On top of all that, as we shall see, McClellan still believes that there is, quote, reasonable doubt that the authors of Leviticus 18 and 20 rejected lesbian intercourse, that while they probably rejected it, the case hasn't been proven. So how is it a straw man to critique a position that even now McClellan partly still holds on to? McClellan says,
and it's only going to go downhill from here.
Actually, I see it as me staying on top of the mountain throughout the entire exercise. McClellan is trying to save face by gaslighting me and covering up the internal contradictions of his own position. It's not going to work for any fair-minded or reasonable observer. Stay tuned for part 3 of my rebuttal of McClellan's video on Leviticus and lesbianism. God bless.